In May 2015, I went camping with my boyfriend at the time, who we'll call Jay, along with another couple who were friends of mine. We decided to head out to a place called Pine Ridge State Park, located at the southernmost part of Virginia. The campground was pretty big, with 3 different loops of campsites. 2 loops were set more in the woods, while the loop we chose was right by the water. Our loop had fewer campers, with only 1 other tent nearby. Pine Ridge State Park is mostly flat and borders a large bay, with a lot of the area being marshland. There's also an old lighthouse not too far from the loop, just a quick drive away. I hadn't done any research on the park before we went. I was just glad to have a break since I was going through a tough time. We set up camp at what seemed like the best spot, right by the water but far enough from the road that no one could see us. Tall grass acted like a curtain, blocking anyone's view of us, making it the perfect place to relax without being disturbed. It was my first camping trip, and Jay wasn't that into it either, so we set up a flimsy tent, but it didn't really matter since we spent most of our time outside it anyway. We walked around and explored the area, strolling through the campground loops and along the shoreline. The scenery was beautiful, but there was a strange, almost eerie vibe about the place that I couldn't quite put into words. It felt heavy, like a stillness that seemed unnatural. At one point, I left the group to use the restroom. As I was walking down the path, I swear I saw this massive tortoise slowly crossing in front of me. It was huge, and as it walked, it seemed to lock eyes with me. It wasn't really a scary moment, but something about it felt off. When I came out of the bathroom, the tortoise was gone, even though it had been moving at a snail's pace. The first night was pretty uneventful, aside from the fierce wind that swept through the park. As I mentioned, the park sits right by the bay, and it's on flat land, so strong winds are pretty common. Unfortunately, because we hadn't set up the tent properly, it flapped around all night, making us feel like it might blow away with us inside. I barely slept. On the second day, we decided to check out the old lighthouse. Since it was spring, they were offering guided tours for a few hours during the day. The tour guide gave us a brief history of the lighthouse and shared some interesting facts. One thing that stuck with me, though the guide brushed over it quickly, was that the man who originally built the lighthouse and the next 2 owners all died not long after moving in. The guide didn't seem to think much of it, but it left an impression on me. We spent the rest of the day hiking, drinking, smoking, and generally enjoying ourselves. When it was time to go to bed, things started to get weird. That night, the wind was completely gone, replaced by an unsettling silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet, it was the type that makes you nervous. Despite that, I fell asleep quickly since I hadn't slept much the night before. Not long after I drifted off, Jay shook me awake, looking concerned. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "No, what happened?" I replied. He said, "I heard someone yell, 'Hey,' right outside the tent. I think there's a man outside." At first, I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was the other couple talking since their tent was close to ours. But then I heard one of them snoring loudly, so loud that even the other campers could probably hear it. That meant they were fast asleep and couldn't have been the ones talking. That I was skeptical at first, thinking Jay might have imagined it since we'd been drinking and smoking. But then I heard it, footsteps. Someone, or something, was walking around our tent. The sound of heavy boots crunched along the gravel. It wasn't just in our heads. This was real. We looked at each other, wondering who was outside our tent and why they were there. The mesh window of our tent was open so we could see outside. We scanned the area, following the sound of the footsteps with our eyes, but we never saw anyone. I had chills as the footsteps moved further down the path and eventually faded away. Jay and I just looked at each other and whispered, "What was that?" We left the next day as planned and told our friends what had happened. They hadn't heard a thing, which wasn't surprising, given how deeply they slept. They probably could have slept through a thunderstorm. Once I got home, I decided to look up more about the park, and everything started to click. Pine Ridge used to be a Civil War prison camp, with the bodies of soldiers buried throughout the park. The camp was notorious for its horrible conditions and overcrowding. There were also rumors of torture, especially in the lighthouse's basement. There have been countless ghost sightings reported, with people hearing or seeing figures walking around. Some even questioning park guests. I'm convinced that what we experienced was one of those ghostly encounters. The heavy boots and the loud "hey" we heard matched other people's descriptions of strange happenings in the park. There are also stories of a woman seen walking along the beach, asking people where her headstone is and if they can help her find it. As it turns out, a woman buried in a nearby cemetery had her headstone stolen, and it was found years later in a hotel in Washington, D.C. It was never returned, so I imagine she'll keep searching for it until it's put back where it belongs. Now that I know the history of the park, I actually want to go back. For anyone who's been to Pine Ridge, have you experienced anything unusual there? I'd love to hear more stories. Thanks for sharing mine. In the autumn of 2017, a friend and I decided to go for a hike late one afternoon in a heavily wooded nature reserve within a state park in the hills not far from Lincoln, Missouri. My friend, Tom, was nearing 55 at the time and was recovering from a major heart surgery he had undergone about 18 months earlier. We had been hiking regularly since his operation to help improve his heart health. That particular day, a weekday, I brought along just a water bottle, my wallet, and my keys, but nothing else for protection. The trail we picked was popular and usually had a good number of people on weekends. We had hiked this area many times before, and neither of us had ever encountered any issues on this or any other trail. Though Tom was older and still regaining his strength, I was in my mid-40s, stood over 6 feet tall, and was in decent shape, so I wasn't too concerned about our safety. This state park was adjacent to a national forest and was a haven for outdoor enthusiasts. Most of our hike that day was uneventful. We took in the vibrant fall colors and casually chatted as the sun dipped lower in the sky. We hadn't seen anyone else that day, which wasn't surprising since we had chosen to hike in the late afternoon on a weekday. After completing about 4 miles of a 6-mile loop, everything had been as peaceful as usual. On our way back, about 2 miles from the parking lot, we noticed someone through a gap in the trees. It was a young woman, possibly a college student, heading toward us. At first, I didn't pay much attention to her, but as the distance between us shortened, something about her posture and facial expression seemed unusual. As she came closer, I could see that she had a somewhat panicked look on her face and was moving quickly. She was dressed in athletic wear, so I figured she might just be running for exercise. But she kept glancing over her shoulder, which caught my attention. Following her gaze, I noticed another person about 50 yards behind her, walking along the same trail. This second person was another woman, but something about her was off. She wasn't wearing hiking gear. Instead, she was dressed in clothes that seemed totally inappropriate for the setting. It was a warm afternoon, we were deep in the woods, and yet this woman was wearing what looked like office casual clothes, including a light jacket. Her outfit was worn and didn't seem clean. She looked to be fit and in her mid-20s or early 30s. Everything about her appearance seemed wrong, including the scuffed leather flats she wore, which were completely unsuitable for hiking. Tom hadn't noticed anything unusual. He was engrossed in conversation. The second woman glanced up briefly as she approached us, making eye contact with me, and suddenly, I felt a wave of discomfort. Something about her look unsettled me deeply. I wasn't sure what was going through her mind, but it felt hostile. Trying to shake off the unease, I averted my eyes, telling myself that maybe she was homeless or just wearing what she could. But despite my attempts to rationalize it, alarm bells were going off in my head. I'm not a paranoid person, but I have good peripheral vision, so I pretended to keep listening to Tom while keeping an eye on the woman. As we passed her, she turned her head sharply to watch us. My unease only grew. After we had walked about 50 yards past her, I glanced back and saw her standing there, staring at us with her face lowered, watching us out of the corner of her eyes. That's when I realized I couldn't see her hands. One was tucked inside her jacket pocket, and the other was hidden behind her body. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. For the next half-mile, we didn't see her again, and I started to wonder if the first woman had sensed danger too. Clearly, she had, which is why she had been moving so fast. It dawned on me that the creepy woman had stopped to assess whether to follow us. Since Tom and I were moving slower, she might have thought we were easier targets. I began checking behind us more frequently, and at one point, I saw her again about 100 yards back, walking briskly with her head down, hands still hidden. Each time we went around a bend and she disappeared from view, she would reappear closer. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid, but I subtly encouraged Tom to pick up the pace. Eventually, he became aware that we were being followed, and though he was uncomfortable, he kept talking. With only about half a mile left to the parking lot, I glanced back once more, and this time, she was only about 10 feet behind us. Her approach had been completely silent. One hand remained in her jacket pocket, and the other was hidden behind her back. I got the distinct feeling she had a weapon, and despite my size, she didn't seem intimidated at all. Her demeanor was threatening, as though she meant to do us harm. I slipped my car keys between my fingers and made a fist. I handed my water bottle to Tom and braced myself for a confrontation. But instead of passing us, she continued to follow us closely, never acknowledging our presence, which made the situation even more unsettling. Finally, I had enough. I loudly told Tom we were going to stop and let her pass, making sure she could hear me. Just as we were about to stop, she veered off the trail into some brush, crossed a ditch, and disappeared through a line of trees toward a service road that cut through the woods. I kept my eyes on her the whole time and noticed she had a car parked along that road, partially hidden by some shrubs. The last time we made eye contact, she seemed furious. I stared back, equally angry. As her car drove off, Tom turned to me and asked, "What was she planning to do? Did she have a gun?" I didn't know, but I was glad she had decided not to follow us any further. We made it back to the car in silence, then decided to call the authorities to report the incident, just in case. To this day, I have no idea what that woman intended, but I'm thankful it didn't escalate. I've hiked that trail more than 50 times since, but I've never seen her again. Hi Swamp Dweller, my name is Alex. In the summer of 2018, I moved to southern Alabama, near the Barlow marshlands. There are tons of snakes and gators all over the place here. For those who may not know, it's one of the largest wetlands in the US, spreading across the southeastern edge of the state and reaching into northern Mississippi. Anyway, my house sits on the edge of a creek, about 12 miles away from a national reserve. It's surrounded by thick woods, and the 4-bedroom home is pretty secluded. Most nights, as I relax on my upper deck, I can hear the gators hissing in the creek below. The deck is on the second floor, above the lower patio, and doesn't have any stairs leading down, so I feel safe from any wild animals like black bears, coyotes, boars, and even, from what I've heard, the rare panther. One evening, while having my second drink, I heard a strange noise coming from the water. It echoed through the air and sounded like a loud, mournful wail. I thought to myself, this is fresh water. What could make a noise like that in a marsh? The sound came closer to my house, and as it made its final call, everything went silent. The crickets, the frogs, just stopped. That's when I felt a chill run down my spine. I had a spotlight on the table next to me, so I grabbed it and shined it toward the water, where I figured the creature might be. What I saw was massive, though I couldn't make out the creature itself. I could only see a huge ripple forming in the water. My heart started racing as I stood up, causing my chair to tip over. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't an alligator. Even the largest 15-foot gator I've ever seen couldn't create such a disturbance. I've hunted gators before with friends, but I'd never encountered anything like this in the marsh. A week later, a friend of mine asked if I wanted to go on a gator hunt. At first, I hesitated, still shaken by what I had seen, but eventually, I agreed. I asked my wife if it was okay, and since she didn't have any plans, I joined him on his boat. We started the day by checking his crawfish traps. As I loaded the rifle and placed our 30 gator tags in a box, I told him about the strange encounter I had. I asked if he'd ever experienced anything like it. He stopped the boat as we neared the 6th trap and told me that his cousin had died under mysterious circumstances involving a creature like the one I had heard. This happened 4 years ago on a quiet night, and no one had ever figured out what happened. No one has ever seen the creature, but the sound it makes is exactly what I'd heard. The way he described it sent shivers down my spine. I felt awful for his loss as he got emotional, and I offered my condolences. After that, he didn't bring it up again, and we continued our day. We caught over 90 pounds of crawfish and managed to snag 12 gators, all between 8 and 10 feet long. It was a productive day. Later that evening, he wanted to head back out on the water to catch some frogs. I reluctantly agreed and brought my .308 rifle just in case. I didn't want him going out there alone, but I was nervous about encountering that creature again. As we got back in the boat, the eerie noise returned, though it was farther off this time. We quickly caught the 18 frogs we needed and began hearing the creature's splashes getting louder. We wasted no time and sped through catching the last few frogs. As soon as we caught the final one, we fired up the boat's engine and hurried out of there. My friend gave me half of the frogs we caught, and the next day our families and friends enjoyed a feast. We both agreed that night to never go out frog catching that late again. We still don't know what that creature was, but the memory of it continues to haunt us. In 2023, my buddy and I made plans for a camping trip. I chose to bring along my dog, Max, a 140-pound Newfoundland mix. Before continuing, it's important to mention that Max is different from most Newfoundlands. He spent the first year of his life living in the wild, which helped him develop great hunting instincts. I found him trapped in my snare lines about a year ago. To cut things short, we built a strong bond during his recovery, and I learned that my new Newfoundland mix could hold his ground in a fight. One afternoon, I came home from work and found 2 coyotes lying dead in the yard. Max had taken care of them. Now he's a sturdy, dependable farm and guard dog. Anyway, one day my friends, let's call them Tom and Eddie, decided to go on a week-long camping trip in southern Alaska. They asked me to join, so we packed up, took time off work, and loaded up my old pickup truck. We headed north. After reaching the wilderness, we shouldered our gear, and I loaded up Max with a small cart I built for him. It allowed him to pull his weight during our summer and fall camping trips, similar to the sled he pulls in winter. The cart carried our tent, sleeping bags, and other light stuff. After covering about 6 miles, we set up camp for the night. I took off Max's harness so he could explore and take care of his needs in the woods. When it was time to eat, I gave Max his dinner while we 3 sat beside the fire, eating beef. Max lay near the fire, resting his head on his paws, quietly watching us. Suddenly, he stood up and let out the loudest, most echoing bark I'd ever heard. The sound echoed through the woods. We looked over and saw some branches shaking, as if something was running away. We figured it might be a raccoon or maybe a bear at worst. Later that night, as we sat chatting, Max had wandered off, probably to relieve himself. Out of nowhere, we heard movement from our left. Thinking it was Max, I looked, but then caught a glimpse of black fur from the corner of my eye on the right. Suddenly, Max came charging through our camp, running straight between us and the campfire. I turned my head just in time to see a man, who appeared to be in his late 50s, rise from the ground with a piece of firewood in his hand, ready to strike. Before he could, Max jumped, crashing right into the man's chest and knocking him to the ground. As soon as the man hit the dirt, Max was already on him. The man realized he was in trouble and tried to scramble for the piece of wood he dropped, but found himself face to face with Max's snarling muzzle. Max stood over the wood, growling. What happened next still seems unreal to me. Max let out a deep, menacing growl before making a deadly lunge for the man's throat, just like he would when hunting. I rushed over to grab Max, while Tom and Eddie helped the man. We searched his belongings and found items that made it clear he wasn't there for a simple camping trip. The man had a wound on his neck, so we decided to cut our trip short and get him to the authorities. We ended up taking him to the hospital, where he stayed for 3 days before being turned over to the police. The man later told the police that he believed God had ordered him to sneak into our tent and kill us while we slept as some kind of sacrifice. He required 3 surgeries before being released from the hospital. To this day, I'm forever thankful for Max. Without him, I don't know what would have happened. So, be careful out there in the wild. Welcome back to the marsh, my friends, and a warm welcome to those who are new. Apologies for my brief absence. I needed a few days to deal with personal matters and recharge. But now I'm back and ready to dive into some eerie and downright bizarre state park and camping horror stories submitted by viewers like you. As always, if you have a tale you'd like to share in a future episode, you can send it to us at marshcreeps.net or the email listed in the description below. I'd be thrilled to feature your story for everyone here in the marsh. Be sure to like this video, subscribe if you're new, and prepare yourself for chilling and strange state park camping stories that will give you goosebumps. Tonight's paranormal story takes place at Fort Warren State Park, shared by Curious J87. For those unfamiliar, Fort Warren State Park is located in the southeastern part of Wyoming, near the town of Grover. It's also close to the Lizard Peak National Preserve. The area has seen its share of violent conflicts between U.S. troops and native tribes, and is the site where Chief Lone Horse was tragically killed. My family has visited the park annually for over 20 years for a reunion, and each of us has our own experiences with the site's supernatural phenomena. These are mine. When I was around 8 or 11 years old, I can't remember my exact age, my family decided to take me on a snipe hunt, which of course was a joke they were all in on. One family member even took me to a nearby natural history museum to get a book on birds to make it seem more real. That night, we went down to an area filled with tall grass near Soldiers Creek. Armed with my bag, stick, and string, I was ready for the hunt. Thankfully, my mother didn't let my brother leave me alone, so he and his friend stayed with me. After a while, I heard rustling in the bag, so I pulled the string tight, and we decided to head back to the cabin. We walked along the dirt road used by the park's maintenance staff and past some of the park's attractions. At one point, we stopped and saw what we thought was one of the adults standing on the right side of the road, waiting for us. The figure had the outline of a head and shoulders, but it looked like it was made of gray mist. It was so dark that we assumed we just couldn't make out the person's features. We called out, "Hey, we're heading back to the cabin," but the figure didn't move. We waited for a while, trying to get their attention, when I finally said, "That's probably just a no trespassing sign or something, not a person." My brother's friend turned on his flashlight and pointed it down the road. "No," he said, "the sign's over there." His flashlight beam revealed the sign in the distance, but when he aimed it at the figure, it was just a gray mass. We ran back to the cabin as fast as we could. When we arrived, we told everyone what we had seen. Some believed us, while others brushed it off as our imaginations. Fast forward to when I was around 13 or 14. I had an old phone, a Nokia that had been recalled because its battery was a little too loose. If you shook it just right, it would shut off because the battery would disconnect. One afternoon, my cousin and I were messing around on the third floor of the house we were staying in. This part of the house had once been the maid's quarters when the building first operated. I was recording a video of us on my phone, but something strange started happening. The video was glitchy, with large black spots appearing on the screen, and it kept skipping as if it was lagging. Later that day, we filmed something outside, and everything worked perfectly fine. Fort Warren is undoubtedly a paranormal hotspot, but unfortunately, it hasn't attracted the attention of any ghost hunting shows that I know of. I'd love to see an investigation team visit the place one day because I'm sure they'd capture some real evidence. I recently went camping with my family at Ridgeview Park in Kauai. We stayed in a cabin located on park grounds because my uncle works with wildlife, though I've never really asked him exactly what he does. The cabin was perched on a hill, overlooking a campsite. I think the camp was called Slate or something like that. As soon as I walked inside, I felt a strange chill, but being the bold person I am, I decided to confront my fear and sleep in that room. Throughout the night, there were moments when it felt like someone wasn't just in the room with me, but almost moving through me. Everyone else in the cabin also randomly got chills and felt cold. The lights flickered, doors creaked open on their own, and strange things happened. When it was finally time to go to bed, everything seemed normal. I was comfortable in my bed, no strange coldness, no uneasy feeling of being watched. Just a cozy bed that allowed me to drift off to sleep easily. But around 1 or 2 a.m., I was suddenly woken up by what sounded like a cat crying. I didn't think much of it because there are lots of stray cats around the island. I closed my eyes again. That's when things got weird. I suddenly felt like someone was right on top of me. The energy around me was so strong it hit me in waves. My ears felt a huge amount of pressure, so much that I could only hear my heartbeat. Each wave of pressure made the sensation even more intense. I kept my eyes shut, facing the wall, hoping it would go away. Then my sleeping bag got pulled tight across my neck, and the uneasy feeling turned into a strong urge to get out of there. I tried to yell for it to stop, but no sound came out. Slowly, the pressure lifted, and the presence disappeared. A few moments later, I heard my younger sister, who was sleeping in the larger bed on the other side of the room, whimpering and shifting around. I lay there for hours trying to fall back asleep, but never really could. This was a camping experience at Ridgeview Park that I doubt I'll ever forget. There's definitely something strange about that place.